So we are starting our fourth session of the day with Georgina and Sebastian. They will they will help us understand more about critical reflexivity, unlocking mastery in team coaching. Georgina is a well-known here in our community. She's the founder and principal of Team Coaching Studio. I'm sure I'm not the only one who admire her work and her effort in team coaching field. And I'm sure she'll be able to talk a little bit more about herself. And Sebastian is actually Dr. Sebastian. She's also a colleague. She's part of the TCS community and has dedicated his professional life to study coaching and how to change in organizations. If you were able to watch Seb's work in any webinar in TCS community, you know how dedicated he is to research and to knowledge. So I would like to welcome both of you, and so you could start helping us to understand a little bit more about critical reflexivity. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, welcome. So everybody, welcome. And I'm very excited to be here with Seb. You know, Seb and I go back away now because Seb was a participant in our first ever team coaching diploma. And you know, we've kept in touch, and Seb has been head of research for the Team Coaching Studio for several years and driving all sorts of research initiatives, not the least doing his own PhD. For those of you who've done anything like that, you'll know that it's one hell of an undertaking. So what we're bringing you today here is in total honesty, this is Seb's work. I'm here as really a support and as a way of bringing this to life. This is Seb's work on critical reflexivity and work he's doing to help us think deeply about how do we make sense of where we are in our learning journey as team coaches? How do we understand where our learning edges are? How do we continue to grow? And that's why I'm so excited to share this work with you here today. So Seb, thank you for being here again, because you did a lovely community session recently. Is there anything I've missed that you'd like to add in the introduction?
Well, thank you, Georgina. And perhaps it might be worthwhile just sharing a couple of words about my research, just to put it into context.
Great idea.
Basically, as Georgina said, I was on the first team coaching diploma, and one of the things that struck me then was the lack of research around team coaching. So that created an opportunity, and I ended up doing some research on team coaching. And just to show what goes around comes around, although my research was actually around how do teams find their coaching to be useful, what it's actually about is emergence. So we're going right back to where we started off today with Caroline and Joe. And you know what I've produced is a meta framework for understanding from a theoretical perspective how emergence happens in coaching. And although that was the main thrust of my research, one of the things that you have to do, particularly when you're doing qualitative studies at doctoral level, although you have to do this to a certain extent at masters as well, is really try and understand what are your own preferences, assumptions, and what's going on, not just about the decisions you make in your research and why you're drawn to particular subjects or questions, but why and what's driving you to that particular aspect or thing you're curious about. And then that's continuously brought back to you. Why have you gone down that route rather than another route? Why have you focused on this piece of data rather than another piece of data? And for me, this was tremendously helpful, because when I started my coach training, the thing that I found most difficult was to write an essay called "Who Am I and How Do I Coach?" That was really hard. So having to go through all this thinking over the past 4 years, particularly, to a lesser extent beforehand, but especially in the past 4 years, has really helped me in my practice. Now, this is not a light bulb moment in the sense that one day you wake up suddenly aware of everything. It doesn't work like that. It's much more around chipping away and chipping away and chipping away. So I'm still on a journey. I still find it difficult, but I know how valuable spending a lot of time thinking about all these things that we're going to talk to you about has been to me and my team coaching practice, and not just my research. So, I was really delighted when Georgina suggested I might be able to share some of these thoughts with you, and hopefully there'll be some things that you can take away for your own practice, and will really help you understand more about yourself, how you coach, and how it impacts the way that you work with teams. So that's really the genesis of where we are now. You're on mute, George.
Yeah, thank you. Somebody sent something to the printer, my printer in the background. I put myself on mute. I like that you said, it's still difficult sometimes. You're still working out. And yeah. I think at least for me as a team coach, over 30 years, I'm still evolving. And how I talk about team coaching in 5 years' time, 2 years' time, 10 years' time is likely to be different because we're integrating all the time. So what we're giving you today is a way of thinking about this. Your thinking won't be the destination, perhaps. It may be something that you keep coming back to as you evolve as a human being. But Seb, I thought it might be useful to start off with, because, we've used quite a technical term here, reflexivity. And I know when I saw you first write about critical reflexivity, I had a reaction to the word critical, because it sounds to me like judgmental or being, critiqued. So would you tell us a bit about, what is critical reflexivity?
Well, I think perhaps I'll come on to some definitions in a moment. Perhaps might be useful if we shared some examples, perhaps, of how we've experienced critical reflexivity, just to bring it to life, and then we could talk about the technicalities of what it actually is from a dictionary point of view. So,
sure, yeah.
Do you want to go, and then I'll jump in?
Well, when we were talking about this the other day, you asked me to share a story about something that happened in team coaching that's kind of shaped my practice. And there's so many moments, but I picked one, Seb, that was a long time ago, because I think it really changed the course, the direction of my life and my work. And that was that I remember back, when I first wanted to work with a team. I was asked by a chief exec that I coached to say, would you consider working with my team? And I agreed. Now, I had a bit of a panic attack after that, thinking, oh my goodness, what have I set myself up for? And I went and bought books on executive teams, and because I particularly work with exec teams rather than teams in middles. What is an executive team? What makes them great? How do you evaluate them? And there weren't any courses around on team coaching, but I wanted tools. So I looked for tools that were around teams, and I wanted a toolkit. And I found a model for high performing teams and used that. And I put that together with, like many others have done probably, a Myers-Briggs kind of workshop, and what's a high performing team, and then something about developing a team charter. So, I think probably a lot of people here will have done the same kind of work. But, in practice, I found that the model I was sharing, which is a research-based model on high-performing teams, just seemed to fall short. It was hard work. It felt like I was trying to convince the team that this model was sound and was something they should pay attention to. And I felt quite frustrated about that. And, I had this internal dialogue, Seb, about, why don't they get it? This is based on research. And if they would just adopt this idea, they could be a lot better. And this not only that, but the program I had offered was structured around this model and the different attributes of what makes a high performing team. So if I couldn't grab their attention around that at the start, I was really on hiding to nothing. But this didn't happen once. This happened several times. And I realized there was something about that was me, that was the common denominator, wasn't it? So I unpacked this in a supervision session, and it was really interesting. First, I noticed something about myself, that I had deep concerns about bringing value, and I want to add value. And I needed a body of research to add weight, to give me credibility to be in the room. When I unpacked that more, I felt that would give me good ground and make me more confident. And I didn't want to show up looking a bit flaky, like I had nothing to bring. And I thought having a model that was backed by research would give me that credibility. But, you know, I was asked another question, which is what and why? Why? You know, keep drilling down why, what's beneath that? And I realized that I thought that I had to bring expertise in order to be enough, that I alone as a coach wasn't enough without it. I felt exposed. So in a way, what I was bringing was a kind of armor. Does that make sense, Seb?
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I think perhaps we can come back to that when we start unpacking some of the elements of reflexivity. But I think that's a really good example of how you know we make assumptions about what clients want and perhaps what we want. And I think in a similar way to briefly share one of my stories. So one of the first coaching assignments that I did, I was co-coaching with someone who was a big team, large organization, and my co-coach was very wedded to Marshall Goldsmith, name mentioned already today, and his stakeholder centered coaching, and for various reasons that that's what we went with. But throughout the team coaching intervention, I just felt really, really uncomfortable using this way of coaching. But I didn't know why. I just know I felt this really intense frustration. And I think that showed up in the coaching. The client certainly detected it. And what happened is I think that the client lost confidence in us as a team, because they could see that, that we weren't a team. So we weren't role modeling the team coaching, and we were approaching from very different perspectives. So, I think that apart from the many lessons that taught me, it really got me curious. Why did I feel such intense frustration about that? And it took me a long time to unpack that, but only through doing the thinking and really, really pulling it back, as we'll talk to what are my assumptions, what's my philosophy, and what drives my beliefs around how organizations work, how people work. So we'll talk about that. But again, that for me was a really powerful example of you might have the physical sensation but not know what's beneath it.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that, Seb. It's sometimes hard to share stories of when team coaching didn't go well, because we start out with good intentions and high aspirations. But something I noticed in both of our stories, and you said it there at the end of yours, was there's a disconnect. My story there's a disconnect, and your story there's a disconnect. Something happened that created like a big disconnect between me and the client, and in that case between you and your colleague and the client. So what happened there, and how do we make sense of it?
Well, shall I start sharing some definitions about critical reflexivity? Oops, if I start in the right place. Oops, sorry. There we go. Right, there we are.
Yeah, that's it.
So these are a couple of textbooks definitions around critical reflexivity, and the first one for me in this context is probably the most helpful. So it's questioning what we take for granted, what we've said and we haven't said, and examining the impact that has or it might have. So for me, there's really this question of what are we taking for granted? Of course, the whole spectrum of things, and I'll come on to what that might look like in a moment. But it's this real deep questioning. And if you look at the bottom definition, this is, again, it's a very technical description, which was actually talking in research. And what it's trying to say, or the way certainly I understand it, is that when you're being reflexive, it's your capability of being able to question yourself in an objective manner. And that's really, really difficult, because we're all subjective beings. So it's really difficult to take an objective stance and really try and distance yourself sufficiently from yourself as the object of your inquiry to really start making sense of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult. And I've also said there's a difference between self and critical reflexivity. And what I mean by that is that, in fact, if when we're in coach training, as those of you who've been through the diploma will know, and others who've done different courses will have experienced the same, that we're taught to be reflective a lot, a lot of reflective exercise. So what happened? And you might be asked at a certain level, why did that happen? But certainly my experience is that it hasn't typically gone below that. So there's a big element of reflective exercise. There might be some self reflexivity. So that's the who am I and how do I coach. But again, I think perhaps the easiest way to articulate that is what's my philosophy and stance as a coach, and knowing that is super important. But I think the difference between that and critical reflexivity is asking yourself, well, why is that my philosophy and stance? What's driving me to believe those things about teams or the way they operate or whatever it is you might be? So the easiest way to think about it is it's another level of self-awareness, perhaps than many of us have experienced, and certainly much deeper level of awareness than I'd experienced before, which is one of the reasons I found it so helpful.
Yeah. So oftentimes I find, Seb, in reflection or peer conversations, what people love and get excited by, and perhaps this has happened today as in this morning's sessions where colleagues were sharing tools and people go, oh, what's that tool? Give me that tool. Give me the details of that tool. We get very excited about how we can fill time and what the best tools are going to be. But from my view, the road to mastery is more vertical development, and vertical development is about growing your capacity as a coach. Yeah. And we can only do that when we know and we can unpack the underlying assumptions that are driving our choices in the moment, or that maybe are undermining us in the moment. So sometimes in reflection or reflective practice, sometimes where people go is, well, maybe that tool didn't work, or I could use a different tool, or what exercise could I use that would be different, or how could I set it up that would be different? It goes to what can I do differently, rather than who am I being and what my core assumptions. And does that chime with what you're saying, Seb?
No, that absolutely, and thank you for bringing up vertical development as well. It's not actually the main thrust of our conversation this afternoon, but it is a really important thing. And in passing, I think one of the things that we are taught as coaches, if we are members of professional bodies, which most people are, is about competencies and building skills and knowledge. And that is all important. But that is horizontal development. Vertical development, as you said, Georgina, is our capacity to make new meaning and make new understanding of what we already know. It's not about adding tools to the toolkit.
Thank you. Paul's just asked there, what do you mean by building your capacity? If I think about my example, Paul, I think if I can really unpack what my assumptions were beneath my drive to try and add value by being knowledgeable and by being backed up by research, then for me what was underneath that was needing to feel enough and needing to know what to do. It was underneath that was an anxiety about just me showing up as a coach. Is that enough? It's not too different from what happened with me when I started one-to-one coaching. It's part of me. But to grow my capacity, Paul, I needed to find different ways of managing that anxiety, rather than, oh, well, that model or tool didn't work. Let me get some different research. Let me go on another course. Oh, what tool do you use? I better go get trained in that one. Which can have us on an endless quest of training courses, trying to fill up our work briefcase with more and more stuff. Whereas often, the more building your own capacity, you discard stuff. You focus more on your core practice. But this is about how do we actually get to that and see that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Thank you. Again, a good description. Thank you. So before we move into the first breakout room, I just wanted to share with you some of the potential issues, perhaps, if we're not sufficiently reflexive and particularly critically reflexive in our practice. And some of these may chime with you, some not. But I think probably the one that will chime most of you is, using models or approaches that are inconsistent with our philosophy and stance as a coach. And that's what I realized eventually about using this Marshall Goldsmith stakeholder approach. It was just completely at odds with my philosophical approach and beliefs. And that's why I felt so uncomfortable using it. But I think there are some much more nuanced, I think, but potentially equally important implications of not being necessarily self-aware, particularly around the models that we use, and that's the risks of linear thinking. Now, you can discuss this in the breakout rooms, but certainly my belief is that organizations and teams aren't linear. They're complex adaptive systems, and you can't predict the outcome of what's going to happen from your intervention. So I think it's just important to understand whether the models and approaches we use, is that suggesting a linear approach? Is it saying it's using a series of steps that will lead to a predetermined outcome? And if that's your approach, that's great. But is it consistent with the way that you understand teams and systems to operate? We've talked about already how critical reflexivity helps your vertical development. It's not the only thing that will help, but it's a really, really large part of it, and will significantly help you if you're able to start developing critical reflexivity. And particularly, as I intimated, as Georgina has explained, it helps you understand the assumptions behind that underlies your models of practices. So, do you believe systems are linear? Do you believe they're complex adaptive? What do you believe about what's your theory of change? I mean, all the things perhaps that we might take for granted, and what underlines them. And I think the one that I feel particularly strongly about, because I hear a lot of people describe their practice in ways that I think might question their understanding of the limits of one-size-fits-all of the models of diagnostics and approaches. And what I mean by that is, if you believe that all team coaching is contextual and situational, again, you may not, but if you do, I strongly suggest that a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to be appropriate in every circumstance. It'll work in some, but it certainly won't work in all. So I think just being clear about something like that is really important. And I think the other thing I'd also say when we're using diagnostics is being really clear about our beliefs around cause and effect, because again, if we don't believe teams and systems are operating linearly, then it's not consistent to believe that a diagnostic will tell us a true picture, if I can use that word, of what's going on in the team, because you can't predict causality in a non-linear system. So it's not correct to say that certain input will lead to a certain output. So again, without going into too much detail, it's just being aware of these limitations. It's not to say using any model or diagnostic is wrong, but it's simply the way that we understand and the way we might describe them to particular clients. Georgina, is there anything you want to add before we go into the breakout room? Or
no, let's do the breakout. Let's get people thinking about this.
Okay. Yeah. So in the same way that you heard Georgina and I describe at the beginning, what we'd like to do is to have you go into some breakout rooms and really think about this question, which we'll post in the chat. And we'll also give you the opportunity to start thinking about how you might think a little bit differently. And we've also got a series of prompt questions, which might just help you think about reflexivity and think about some of the questions that you might ask yourselves. And if you can do that is it 10 minutes, Georgina? I think we allocated for this, 10 minutes. Yeah. Then we'd like to come back and hear from you what you've experienced and what you felt came up for you during the session. So any questions or any clarification needed, Caroline?
Seb, just one quick thing. Someone asked you to state what is the difference, clear difference between reflection and critical reflexivity in a short sense. Can you say what is the difference?
Sure. The easiest way to think of the difference is when we're being reflective, we're thinking about what's happened. And we might, to a certain level, as Georgina talked about during supervision, be asked, why did that happen? Critical reflexivity is about asking ourselves, what are the assumptions that I've made, or what am I taking for granted that have led me to do what I did, and why I did it. So that's a distinction. So it's between the what and the why behind the assumptions.
Mhm.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Yeah, so like we did in my example, when you go into breakout rooms, perhaps one person think about a story or an experience where you felt there was a bit of disconnect or something didn't feel quite right. And then the group who are with you can ask questions to help you, if you're willing, to unpack what assumptions might have been driving your choices. And see if you can get to a sort of root assumption underneath it, like I did. It can be really liberating when you discover that.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to have a conversation. Hopefully that's at least started to open your thinking a bit to critical reflexivity. What we'd like to do is, as with previous sessions, invite you to both share what's come up in your discussions, if someone is happy to come off mute and share with the wider group, or if you feel more comfortable sharing it in the chat, then please do so. And it'd be nice to hear what some of you have been discussing. So,
and we've got time for 2 or 3 shares, about 10 minutes, haven't we? Lovely.
Yeah.
Well, I can start.
Oh. Thank you, John.
Nice to see you all. Nice to see you all today. We talked about coming together with a dominant leader, stakeholder, and 2 teams, and how the wishes of the leader influenced how the coach was actually working with the team, and also the coach was working through a structured model which took away from the ability to actually begin to sense and feel what was happening with the team, because there was the preoccupation of what does the leader want and how do I stay with the model to move them through it. And as the coach was unpacking it, what we heard was there was a sense that things weren't right. There was a sense that there was an opportunity to change. And in reflection, and in critical reflexivity, it was very much around, I was feeling it, but I wasn't doing anything with it in the moment.
Okay.
And I want to stop there and see if those that were in our breakup room can add to that or build on it or push back on what I said.
Thank you, John. And I've got a follow-up questions, but I'll just wait and if anybody else wants to jump in then from your group.
I was the coach, so thank you, John. You summed it up really well. Not sure there's a lot to add, actually. I think you covered it really well.
And Craig, if you are happy to answer this question, but understand you may not be, what assumptions were you making, or what were you taking for granted when you found yourself in that situation?
I think the assumption there were several, but the first one was that what the sponsor wanted is the right thing for everybody. And I didn't spend enough time to actually investigate what might the team need and how might I achieve some kind of balance between potentially achieving both. And I think I'm aware now that when you've got a long-standing one-to-one relationship which bridges into a team opportunity, I didn't do enough at the beginning to sort of almost like compartmentalize what I'd been doing one-to-one and saying, look, this is going to feel different. And like, what do you need as the sponsor to feel comfortable in this process when there are other parties involved rather than it just being you and me.
Okay. And if you were to peel that back another layer, what is it about your philosophy and stance that perhaps led you to make those assumptions?
Well, this is what I was saying to John, was that at that stage, I hadn't really sort of articulated well what my philosophy and stance were. So I was, to use the analogy of the tree from this morning, I wasn't rooted. I was bending, but I wasn't even in the ground. I'd kind of been yanked out the ground and was being blown around.
Wow.
So actually, the really important thing for me that left me with was, what do I stand for? And I've got to be clearer about that so that I can articulate that from the get-go in support of then the following process.
Right. Well, thank you, Greg. That's a really, really generous of you to share that in front of everybody. Thank you. But also a really powerful example, I think, of certainly when we're starting out coaching, how it can be easy to fall into what we assume we think the client wants or what we think we want without being clear about it.
Well, and I just add one point. I went through a training program with a non-TCS organization, and philosophy and stance didn't come into it. So it's fascinating to me that, having engaged in the retreat last summer, there was a lot of stuff that came up that was brand new to me. And to me, it feels like a really big gap in how other organizations train team coaches. So hats off to you for actually really bringing attention and focus to that, because I think it's vital.
Thank you, Craig. Well, I think sometimes when people they want to learn, give me the sort of the toolkit and the how-to first. And then when things like happen, like what happened with you, and they happen to all of us, it's often only through those critical moments that we get the real opportunity to reflect on our philosophy and stance. So it is a sort of integrative, or in a way, a more advanced place that we often get to the other side of lived experience, and often uncomfortable lived experience. But those experiences are such gifts in the long run. So yeah, really take my hat off to you for sharing. I'll just put you off spotlight. I saw that Emma had her hand up earlier on. Where do we want to go from here? Are you coming back in, Emma, or?
Yeah, if there's time. Is there time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. And just, I'm kind of like, God, I hope I get my words right, speaking in front of this amazing group of peers. Yeah, so great to see everyone. A really interesting one came up in our group around power, and kind of, we were talking about C-suite, and that we have this, some of us might have an assumption that, oh gosh, they're C-suites, they have this certain expectation, we have to get results met. Yeah, exactly. Like, that thing. And I think it's we talk about when we start as team coaches that maybe that's more present, but equally I think there's these choice points, aren't there, that something can happen later on where suddenly you're met with that again in a different format. And I think the things that we started to talk about was, what's the story? And I guess in this case it's around power and authority. What's the story behind how we've given that person that power? What's the story? And there's always a story behind. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to add, really. Hope it's helpful.
Yeah, very much so. What's the story behind the story, and the why behind that? So it's like layers of an onion in a way, isn't it? That we peel away, but keep the lens on ourselves. Yeah, thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Thank you. Max, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So in the group, we found it quite useful to have this reflection you suggested, and we talked about that. But I want to bring in two questions I also mentioned in the group that go beyond it. The first one is about asking the question, why am I behaving that way? And I think why is always a difficult question, because it leads you to the mind. And if I prefer what also has been mentioned right now, going deeper, what is behind, which is an exploration that includes all our senses. So when I ask why most likely I will not feel how my heart is doing. I will think about it. So that is the one part. And the other, like when you said making yourself the object, that again leads you to a distance. You're taking yourself apart into an observer, and this is real tricky and not really possible. What's possible is being more integrated in your experience as I experience it. Or let's say both is doable, but when I still look at myself as an object, I'm still most likely will try to manipulate myself. And that's the next trap. Thank you.
Thank you,
Max, thank you for sharing that. And in fact, we are going to share next a framework for reflexive thinking, which I think will address exactly the first question that you've posed there. And I agree. I think the why there's a real danger of just staying in your head and missing all the other senses that are useful to help you unpack what's behind. I think my own view about making yourself the object of inquiry. I mean, believe me, I when I first read that, I thought, oh, well, that's just not possible, isn't it? But the more I thought about it, the more actually I find that distancing sometimes useful, and I think for me, you know, what we're trying to do is to give you some questions to ask yourself that might be helpful, and you know, with all these things, if they're helpful to you, great, use them. If they're not helpful, don't. You know, they're not. What we're absolutely saying is you must use these questions to develop your reflexive thinking. I would imagine part of the reflexive process for each of us is to understand what do we need to ask ourselves in order to develop better understanding. And there may be some of the questions we'll show you in a moment. There'll probably be lots of others as well. Georgina, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that.
Oh, and you say that I think the for me the language is sort of, it comes from vertical development and this idea that between subject and object, what we're subject to has a hold on us. So if I stay subject to the idea that I've got to prove my value by having academically researched models and the top quality framework and those sorts of things, then I'm subject to that. That's got a grip on me. And to grow, I want to be at choice around, I want to turn it around, be at choice over the decision in the moment. So instead of me being, you know, subject is what I'm embedded in, and an object being what I can step back from, what I can reflect on, what I can make different choices around. So that's really where our language comes from. But I hear you, and I think it's a really, really valid point, Max, and about not distancing from ourselves. I think that's the opposite of our intention, really, is to distance from ourselves. It's to really, it sounds like we have the same core intention, just different language is what I'm saying. Yeah. So let's build on this a bit, Seb.
Yeah. Are there any questions in the chat, by the way, before we move on? No. No.
Okay.
Fine. So let me share again. So what we'd like to do now is hopefully address exactly the point which Max, you just raised about different ways that we can start critically reflexive practice. And this is a framework which I've adapted for an article that's coming out fairly shortly, the Philosophy of Coaching, which you'll be able to access in due course when I get my hands on it. But it was a framework for reflexivity developed by Linda Finley, who has written and spent a lot of time thinking about her own reflexivity. And she created 5 lenses of self and critical reflexivity around strategic, contextual, discursive, embodied, relational, and ethical reflexivity. She did that specifically in the context of helping researchers when they are thinking about their own research and how they might interact with participants and interact with themselves and interact with their data. And I really like this framework, and I used it and wrote another article, which was published a couple of years ago, which had a version of this table in. And what I think is that there's the start here of some of the questions that might help you think about reflexivity in different ways. Starting with one that I added to the table, which was, if you take a real step back and look at the meta perspective, wider ecosystem, what's happening outside us that might be impacting the way that we are behaving, that we're being, that we're relating with ourselves and relating with others. And from that point, we can then start asking us different questions, and there'll be lots of other ones you might wish to ask yourself as well, but different questions around, what's our philosophy and stance? What is my way of making meaning around different contexts and situations? How am I noticing about what my somatic experience tells me? Do I take any notice of them? Or if I do take notice of them, what meaning am I making from them in the moment? And what does it mean for my practice when I'm working with teams? And then a really important one, relational, how do I relate to myself and how do I relate to others? And I found this quite a difficult one to answer, because I was thinking, what do I mean? What do I understand by this? And in a sense, it's still a question I'm posing myself, because there's something around presence when it's in an external relationship with others, but it's I think for me the best way I can describe it and the way I experience it is how comfortable am I with who I am and my presence, and how I understand what I do and my purpose and my motivation. And these are all things, as Georgina, you alluded to a little while ago, these things have all changed significantly over the past however many years it is, 8-9 years since I did the diploma, and they'll continue to change. But it's been a really helpful starting point for me. And then the last one, the ethical implications. And some of you may have a bit of reaction, thinking, well, what's this doing here? And it really goes back to what I was saying about the dangers of making assumptions about models and linearity and diagnostics, which are inconsistent with the way that we understand or believe meaning to be made and believe systems to work. And particularly, I think the danger here is that we claim things about what a particular model will deliver or what a particular diagnostic will show, which might not actually be the case in practice. So that there's a potential disconnect happening there. So again, I'm not saying don't use them. What I'm saying is just be clear about what assumptions those models and diagnostics are making, and what assumptions you're making, and contract accordingly. And if you're clear, the client's clear, that's okay. That's all right. But just beware otherwise. And for me, this was a really helpful starting point. And I also like infographics because it just helps me. It's actually putting these together which helps me as much as anything. But it's also useful when explained to other people. And this was a little infographic I came up capturing the different types of reflexivity and how I situated them within my wider system of reflexivity. And you can use that or not if you wish. But I'm going to pause there, and Georgina, I'm going to invite you to come in and perhaps share one or two examples of how you've experienced things that when you've applied some reflexivity to them, you've created different meaning or new awareness around them.
Well, I think the one we've talked about probably in my example might be strategic reflexivity. And I think that was there in your example perhaps as well, Seb, where you found that with your co-coach, you had different philosophical assumptions about how change happens and about our role in that change. I think there's something about how we make meaning in different situations. So earlier on today, I was thinking about an example of a team I was coaching where one individual in the team was very determined that he was right. And he held this idea that he is always right. And he said that to the team. Now, I was quite surprised that somebody would give voice to that with the team. I am always right, though, but I am, aren't I? And the team were really, really frustrated with him about that, because it meant that his view by his eyes carried more weight than it did in their eyes. And they started withdrawing from conversations. But I realized over time, I was working with them over some time. I realized at one point when I was traveling on my way there on a long train journey to the session, that my mind kept going to him. And that was where my focus had been. And I kind of locked on my mind on him. At the moment I think, I can even feel it now in my stomach, now I'm talking about him and thinking about him, I was feeling really frustrated and irritated by this person and their lens. And can't they see the value of engaging with others? And I think when you talk about that contextual and discursive category, it's how I make meaning, because at that time I was making meaning about looking at the individual in the system rather than looking at the system itself. And if I'd stood further back and looked at the system, I would have looked at it as a more dynamic interrelational system than wanting the one person to change. It's quite interesting, actually, because I found out later that he had been brought in by the leader of the team for that very reason, because he had a tremendous capacity to critique performance, and he was told to come in and disturb. And but they didn't know that. He hadn't been told that. So he was kind of playing a role, and then embodied there. I really felt it in my somatic experience. I'm going back into that soma now as I think about that train journey and how I felt in that situation, and how difficult it was to voice it. So I think what I'm wondering is, Seb, and what I'm thinking out loud now is that we could look at any one of these sort of trickier situations, and maybe at some level, all of these lenses apply.
Yeah.
One might be the first gateway.
Yeah.
For exploring it. Now, I've got a bit of an eye on the clock, and we want to get into people a bit of time, don't we, to have another little activity here.
Yes, we do, and again, thank you for sharing that example, Georgina. And I think you're right. Each of these or each situation, I think, could be understood through the different lenses and different meaning made. So what we'd like to do is to put you in the breakout rooms again, and taking the framework which we just shared with you. Again, perhaps one person can share an example, and perhaps a different person this time, and start asking some questions around what underlying assumptions, but use the framework if it's helpful for you, and focus on different aspects and see if that helps the person unpack different meaning again. But time maybe for one or perhaps two people to share what was coming up for you in your breakout room. So would anybody like to come off mute and share a little bit with us what was discussed?
Even if what you discussed isn't completed thinking, it's just really interesting to see where you went with it. Yeah, Candida.
Candida, indeed. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. What I found really fascinating about that is once you kind of have a space within which you are then choosing to think. So we chose to think about it through the systemic lens. We then, it was so much more, it was easier to really just kind of test the boundaries of that. And you had a space within which you could actually then, you went into a room and then you knew what you had to do there. So there were things, okay, why don't you look at it like that? Why don't you shine spotlights somewhere? Why don't you look at what's happening between something? So once we had done that, that felt so much easier. So in that sense, the framework, but because I was the one who was coached there, I found that really useful to just actually say okay, now I've got a mental model within which I can think and test those assumptions that I'm having. So
Thank you, Candida, for sharing that. And I think that's really important because, notwithstanding what we were saying, having models and a framework, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to share those different categories and lenses, usually helps us to start thinking and going deeper. And I'm very happy to share this, that when I did this work, I had to have some supervision lessons with Linda Finley because I just was not capable of doing it on my own. So I completely understand that having someone to help you think and give you some other ways of looking at something is really helpful. So thank you for sharing, Candida.
Yes, it's often the relational process of being in dialogue with someone else about your situation that I find helps me unfold. It's a bit harder just with a bit of paper on my own, which is why I love supervision. Rachel.
Yeah.
Rachel Mellows, let's hear from you.
Hello. I was going to say exactly what you just said, Georgina, actually, which is when we went into the breakout rooms where my head was, that I found it a really interesting set of lenses and I loved the framework. And I guess I got it intellectually, but I was still sort of working through in my mind, how does that relate to an example? And actually what happened really naturally is through the course of our conversation in a group that it just evolved into, okay, well, how about this and how about this? And I realized actually just how valuable actually working with people in that safe space in this critical reflexivity topic is going to be, because it's easier then to talk it through, but to go deeper than perhaps where we might naturally start off. So I want to say thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And probably we'll have time for Sophie, and then we'll wrap up. So, Sophie. Well, Sophie, did you want to come in?
Sorry, I'm talking on my own here, alone in Canada. I just wanted to say, I think I'll be repeating some of the things that has been said, but I wanted to add that when you showed the slide, I was reading it and it made sense. But what was different for me in practicing it and listening to my colleague present her situation, I just could see the space change, shifting the space between us in terms of we were slowly, I mean, we needed more time, obviously, but I just loved how something was happening. And I would have loved like another half hour just to see where this would have brought us. But I think the trust, creating the fabric of trust and again, the space to be able to lean in, that's what it did for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sophie. And Georgina, perhaps you'll touch on this in a moment, but certainly working with another person, other people, I think is a tremendously powerful way to start modeling to each other and helping each other really start unpacking the layers of onions that Georgina mentioned earlier. So thank you, Sophie.
Yeah, listening to you, Sophie, and others, I'm one of the things that's beautiful about this is I think we've demonstrated that you can do this with peers. It doesn't have to be informal supervision. I mean, that's very helpful. And one of the things that supervision provides is a fixed container where we're saying we're now going to take a look at our work. But that, we can create that if we make time for that in our practice and we make that commitment to each other. But, the phenomena I notice is that if somebody said, there's this amazing course you need to do on this high-performing teams assessment tool, or on this activity you can use with the team, often the energy goes way more towards that. What can I add on to my practice, rather than that work on self? But for those who are really committed to a road of mastery, that's my encouragement, is to take that time and that commitment to really honoring yourself and unpacking for my being what's happening for me, what's beneath that in my team coaching, so that I'm more free to make a broad array of choices. So thank you so much for sharing that, Sophie. I'll just take you off spotlight here for now. Yeah. Yeah, wonderful observation. So as we wrap up this part of the session, so what comes to mind for me is, you know, when we met team coaching, there were very few team coaching courses available, perhaps only 3 or 4 or something like that. There were very few books on team coaching, probably only one, and that was very focused on theory and models and tools. There's been an underlooking a deficiency of looking at ourselves and the impact of self on team coach as a team coach. I think the work you're doing, Seb, in your research and encouraging others to research is really helping us to understand in a more grounded and a deeper way that question of what really builds efficacy. How can I take myself on a journey to become a better team coach and a truer version of myself? So I wondered if you might wrap up. I know we've been talking about critical reflexivity today, but I just wanted to highlight your fascinating research on emergence as well, and whether you wanted to say a few points about that, because Seb, I think it's very related. You see, when people struggle with working emergently, often if they go through this reflexive process, what I find is similar to my own experience of anxieties about filling time and not being enough, and what happens if I can't control the situation, and those sorts of things. So is there anything in your research about emergence that you want to say? Have I put you in the spot there?
Well, that was an emergent question for sure. Let me just think about that for a moment. One thing I would say, just while I'm give you a slightly more relevant answer, is that for me, the whole process of doing research is actually very emergent, because where I started out and where I ended up were very different things. And if I had stayed in my mind frame of looking or hoping to find things that confirmed what I thought at the beginning, I would not have been able to create the space and awareness to allow emergence of what did come out in the end. So, you know, there was an interesting bit of parallel processing, which actually was part of my reflexive journey when I was doing the doctorate. But I think the biggest thing for me in emergence that I learned going through was building the capacity to be comfortable in not knowing. And I thought Joe and Caroline gave a beautiful example of that this morning in the first session. But there is something really quite frightening or anxiety provoking about walking into a team coaching session and not having a tool to mind or framework or knowing really what it is you're going to talk about if you haven't done the work on yourself beforehand. I would argue it's probably impossible to do that unless you've done the work on yourself beforehand. And part of that is the critical reflexivity that we've been talking about, that allows you to unpick and develop that awareness around yourself and what triggers you and what doesn't trigger you, that will give you the space to work in that way. So I think that for me is a really important part of emergence. And I think the other thing, and I'll leave you all with this thought, what my research showed was actually that teams find emergent goals and unexpected outcomes more helpful to them in service of achieving their desired change than meeting pre-agreed goals or whatever was contracted at the outset. So it's not just us saying, oh, well, you know, if you let it emerge, you know, the magic happens. It's the teams recognize this as well. So, you know, if nothing else, perhaps you can hold on to that and say, actually, it's not just us, it's the teams as well that understand it. So without going on for too long, those were some things
Well,
that
it's
mindful
two
me.
important pieces of research there that we'll look out for from you, Seb. And one is the piece on critical reflexivity, which is going to be available in public domain. And then I know your research on emergence will be coming out, and is a very important piece of work, and it needs people like you who are really committed to the research process in depth to help illuminate how we collectively grow as team coaches. And I'm very grateful for you sharing that with us here.